So the title of what I'm going to talk about is Leading Beyond the Ego. We believe this is a really important topic to address, because we believe that in the future, it's what the stakeholders of companies will expect people to think in a totally different way. So if I can get this moving. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we've got a rapidly changing world. That's the first thing to remind ourselves of, something that is pretty unstable. We're coming out of COVID. We thought we were going to come into some bright sunshine, but these are the issues that are really important for leaders to be thinking about as the world changes, from biodiversity to education to population growth, and of course, war and diversity. And at the moment, we've got this extra problem, of course, of conflict, polarization in our politics, wars and conflicts. And these all have a huge impact on how we're going to lead in the future. So the way we look at it, there are sort of 4 levels of leadership. The first level is cognitive, which is where we think rationally. And this is basically the area, the type of leadership that we're taught to be rational, to be thinking things in a logical way, and to be thinking in a linear way as well. But we also, and I think more and more people are realizing this, that we now have to be emotionally aware and have emotional intelligence, which requires us to have because we need to have the right kind of behaviors to build relationships and generate performance. But we also need an extra level, which we call spiritual. Some people don't like using the word spiritual because it confuses with religion and mysticism and so on and so forth. But basically, spiritual is about values and about ethics. And we need to operate in full consciousness of our values if we're going to be good leaders. And then there is a 4th level, which sort of brings these 3 together, which is our systems thinking. It integrates the various aspects of leadership, but it also makes us think about the causes and consequences. How often do leaders make mistakes because they haven't thought things through, because they haven't thought of the consequences? And so that brings us much more to a systemic thinking, a quantum thinking, where everything is dependent on everything else, rather than the old Newtonian linear thinking. We look at this in terms of intelligences. Basically, we're looking at 3 intelligences that we have as human beings: the rational intelligence, the emotional intelligence, and the spiritual intelligence. All I want to show here is the fact that where they connect with each other, it has a particular impact. So when we connect the rational intelligence with the emotional intelligence, that's where we get the enhanced performance. Where we connect spiritual intelligence and emotional intelligence, that's where we connect the caring and the sustainability. And the rational and spiritual intelligence brings us the ethical. And when we bring it all together, it's what we call transpersonal leadership. So in this rapidly changing world, the right kind of future requires leadership that is more decentralized and distributed, more inclusive yet emergent, more values-based, and more caring. This is the only way that we can handle systemic thinking. We can't do it from a centralized point of view. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go forwards. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but this is just a picture of the journey that we take leaders on from the beginning, right from the beginning of understanding leadership, right up to the thinking about the greater good and what one's purpose is in life. And bearing in mind, this is a kind of an important thing to always remind ourselves that everybody, and this is leaders in particular, think of changing the world, but very few think about changing themselves. And this is really important. We always believe that a great leader can only start by changing themselves and developing themselves in their behaviors and their attention to values and so on and so forth before they can think about changing organizations, being successful with strategy, etc., etc. So let's ask a question now for you to consider about yourself. What drives your ego? And here, when we talk about ego, we're talking about the things, what it is that might make you egotistical, thinking of yourself over other people, over the greater good. There are 4 drivers in our experience. The first one is power. The second is prestige. The third, recognition. The fourth, reward. The question is for you to think about, and for all leaders to think about, what is the main driver of our ego? Now, there's nothing immoral in having an ego. So it's not something that's right and wrong, but it's something that we need to be conscious about. Which of those 4 have the most impact on us? They will all have some impact. I know that in my own experience when I was younger, it was probably power. I wanted to be at the top of the organization. I wanted to be able to make decisions, make things happen because I thought I was the best at doing it. Kind of naive, but there you go. I think we all go through that kind of stage. Today, if I'm honest, it's probably recognition. It's nice to be recognized for one's achievements, but I think we all have to be really honest with ourselves. And this can be something that you can also discuss and communicate amongst yourselves, is which is the driver that most impacts you? Which do you have to be most careful about that it doesn't overtake what you really want to achieve as a leader? So you've basically got the choice of becoming an ego-based leader, and we see them all the time in many organizations, or are we going to be transpersonal in the interest of all our stakeholders? And what we have to remember is that as leaders, we are actually paid by an organization to do the best for that organization and its stakeholders. We're not paid to do the best for ourselves. Of course, as individuals, we have to think about our family and our own careers. And there's, again, nothing wrong with doing that. But we have to be aware of these things so that we manage it and we don't come into conflict. And if we do have conflict, find somebody to discuss it with to help you move forward with a decision. So let's look at thinking about your own company now. Who's the most important stakeholder in your business today? Is it the shareholders, senior executives, which is quite common in large companies, staff and employees, customers, suppliers, the community that surrounds where the company is, or is it the planet? And I'd ask you to really think about this. But then perhaps what is more important is who needs to be the most important shareholder in your business for success in the future? How should this be changing? How should this stakeholder priority be changing? I mean, we all know that the planet has to take a more important, we're more conscious as humanity that the planet has to take more importance than it has in the past. 20, 30 years ago, the planet wouldn't have been on the list probably. But it's something that we really need to decide. And this may change from circumstance to circumstance, of course. Many public sector organizations, for example, would actually, the reality is that their staff and employees are more important than the customers. Think of hospitals where sometimes the doctors feel themselves to be more important than the patients, just as an example. So we have this transpersonal cycle where we start off with awareness, bringing these things into awareness. And then how do we use that to change our behaviors? Then how do we raise our consciousness, our level of consciousness? Because consciousness is more than awareness. Consciousness is what you do with awareness, if you like. It's how you put that into action using the values that we have, our core values. How do we use our core values in everything we do? I'm just going to take you through a couple of deep dives into the kind of programs that we do. So we have this model where we have 8 integral competencies of leadership. So this is what leadership is made up of. At the top there is personal preferences. That's about, who you are, what you like doing. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Do you feel, do you think, who are you? Do you like planning? Do you like making decisions at the last moment? All those kind of things. And then knowing that, it's about raising awareness. Self-management is so important. How many managers and leaders do I know that are not good at self-management? They depend on other people. Social awareness. How do we relate to other people? And relationship management. How do we build those? Having understood other people, how do we build our relationships? And then in the spiritual intelligence side, we have the personal conscience and the self-determination. We split those, values into 2 things: personal conscience to self-determination. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then, of course, we have the IQ, which is still very important. It mustn't be forgotten, but at the moment, it's probably used more than it should be. So let's go back to the beginning. As human beings, what we've got to remember is that most of our default behaviors and attitudes come from the Stone Age. Our brains haven't changed. A baby born today is almost identical to the baby born in the Stone Age. The reason that we're different as adults to Stone Age adults is the experiences we've had, the culture we're in, our education, who our parents were. And a lot of that, of course, is down to serendipity. It's not something that we're in control of. We weren't in control of how we got educated as children or as teenagers. But what we are in control of is how we develop ourselves as adults, what we do with ourselves, how we learn and what we learn. So a typical thing here as a leader, a default is, to know everything and tell people what to do. How many leaders do we know who do that? And even the best leaders who know better than doing that, and that isn't effective, still do it when they're stressed. There are times I know this so well, and yet there are times when I'm stressed and I will just say, oh, why can't we just do it? So these are very important things to be aware of. We've got in our brain, we've got this emotional intelligence highway where we get the stimulus from our senses, from our vision, from our hearing, etc., that goes through the thalamus. And then the default way, the Stone Age way, is to go directly to the amygdala, where we have some sort of emotional response. We get hijacked. What we've got to learn to do as human beings, as advanced human beings, is to go that slower route through our prefrontal cortex, so that we can think, we can reflect, we can think logically about how to handle that emotional stimulus, and then also go through the hippocampus, which is where our memory banks are. So this is very important, and with practice we can learn to do that. We can learn to reroute how the senses go through our brain. I'm saying a little bit more about emotional intelligence. Again, I don't have time, and you probably wouldn't want to hear me go through this in detail anyway. But the point is that within the emotional intelligence model, there are 4 basic competencies: self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, relationship management. Within that, there are 19 capabilities, emotional intelligence capabilities. I'm not going to go through those. But what is really important is that for each of those 19 capabilities, there are 4 granular behaviors that make them up. So that's 72 granular behaviors that make up emotional intelligence. I'm just going to show you one of them, empathy. We can see that the empathy is basically, there's 4 granular behaviors made up of that, of empathy, listening attentively, demonstrate awareness of feelings, identify the cause of the perspective, and to express our understanding of that perspective. So once you break it down to that level, it's quite easy, either by yourself or with a coach or with colleagues, to identify, you know, how effective are you in each of those simple granular statements. But just remember, emotional intelligence requires 72, and most of us are pretty good at most of them. But there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 emotional intelligence granular behaviors that we're not so good at. And that's the difference between being an adequate leader and being a good or great leader. What we also find is that we have these leadership styles. And what we find in most organizations is that the pace setting and commanding styles are the most frequent. And yet visionary and coaching and democratic are much more effective in the long term, usually. There may be a crisis situation where you have to use commanding. Now, the thing is that each of these leadership styles are made up of 3 or 4 capabilities, which means they're made up of 12 or 16 granular behaviors, which means that we need to know 12 or 16 granular behaviors in a positive way to be able to adequately utilize these leadership styles. And then we come on to a culture. How do we turn leadership styles into culture? Well, we've done a lot of research, and what we see, if you look at the darker colors there, is this is the typical culture that we will find in a large or commercial organization. In fact, in most organizations, is that power is the most important parameter, followed by structure, rules and regulations and processes. Achievement is not that high, and support is even lower. But if you ask people, the same people who live in these cultures, what would their ideal culture be? They will give you the light blue. They want achievement and they want support. So if we can identify that, and move towards that, then we can identify those granular behaviors that will make the difference in a culture. We can also identify which leadership styles relate to achievement and support. And they are visionary, democratic, coaching, and affiliative, not the commanding or the pace setting. So that takes care of the awareness and the behaviors. Let's move on a little bit to the deeper stuff, the consciousness and values. Personal conscience values. These are the most common that we come up with when we do studies and research and so on and so forth. And the most common are the top 4, which you'll see in, you know, papers done by the big 4 consulting organizations or McKinsey or whatever. Trustworthiness, truth and honesty, excellence, integrity. They're all important. And I don't think anybody would deny that. Whether leaders are very good at that in general is a question, but it's recognized that those things are needed. But that's not enough. We need some of this, the gentler, the softer values, which are really important as well to be great leaders. We need fairness. We need conscientiousness. We need humility. We even need vulnerability. I mean, this is something that leaders generally struggle with, this vulnerability one. You know, how do I show my weaknesses? You know, is that going to, that people aren't going to like that. The reality is that in my experience is that when leaders are able to demonstrate where they've gone wrong, explain where they've gone wrong, and that they're aware of that and they're doing something about it, that gets a tremendous support, and it gives other people the permission to also be vulnerable and to accept their mistakes, because that's the first step of learning new stuff. Patience, forgiveness, and altruistic love. By that, I mean, you know, the non-romantic type of love. These are all really important values. And it would be good if you can spend time thinking about, which are the most important ones for you. What is natural to you? I mean, I know for me, fairness is a really important one. Humility is something I sometimes struggle with, but I know I need to work on it. And then we have what we call the self-determination values. So where personal conscience values are about who I am, self-determination values are about what am I going to do with who I am? And that's perhaps the most important leadership area of leadership of all. The differential between a leader and a non-leader is that self-determination. What are you going to do with who you are? Where you use your courage, resilience, aspirations, etc., etc. I'm happy to make these slides available afterwards if people are interested. And then finally, or almost finally, I hope I'm still doing all right. When we think of decision making, we tend to, and we've been trained to think rationally and logically. But we also need to think of our subconscious processes. There are 5 decision-making processes. Intuition, which is based on our experience, which has bias built in. We have instinct, which is based on our innate opinions and one could say the intuition of our forefathers, which is unconscious. Insights. This is a sort of involuntary feeling of insights. And then ethical philosophy. We need to use all these processes. Again, I don't have time to go into this in detail unless you ask specific questions about it. But it's very rarely, unless it's a purely numerical exercise, that we make a decision based on rational and logic. We usually use rational and logic to explain and justify a decision that we reach through a subconscious process or a range of subconscious processes. So one of the things we like to help leaders do also is build their own touchstone. A touchstone is a standard by which something is judged. So what we do is when we're making an important decision, what are the things that we've got to take into consideration? Which values do we need to take into consideration? In addition to these transpersonal qualities of caring, being radical, ethical, authentic, sustainable, emotionally intelligent, and performance enhancing. If we use this checklist when we're making important decisions, then we'll make sure that we bring everything that's subconscious in our brains to full consciousness. And these are the kind of things that you as individuals can be thinking about of what you'd like to add to your core values when you're making a decision. Okay, I think I've probably spoken enough, but I think what's really important is to remember that from a values-based perspective, it's our choices that show who we really are much more than our abilities. Okay, that's it. There's a whole load of reference materials that and there's that QR code if you're interested in linking up with me on LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to do that. And that's, I think, hopefully I've thrown out enough substance to interest you to ask some questions. Thank you very much.